Well, first of all, for Woodrow Wilson, he saw one specific element, the League of Nations, as particularly important towards the long-term peace and security of the nations. The League of Nations, think essentially a predecessor of the United Nations with a little bit less power. But we'll get to why it had less power in a minute here. As you see, all these countries in Europe had already signed on to this bridge to peace, and the U.S. was the last one. So Woodrow Wilson negotiates this grand, wonderful peace treaty, essentially by himself, with almost no input from the legislative branch, and that ended up causing some trouble. Because for many legislators, who, by the way, had no role, they saw that League of Nations as something much more insidious. Here we have England, Japan, European nations, and foreign powers in general getting the U.S. stuck in foreign entanglements. They felt that by signing up for the League of Nations, for better or worse, we would be strapped into these European and world conflicts for many years to come. Now again, this probably could have been prevented had Woodrow Wilson involved congressional leaders more broadly in the formation of the Treaty of Versailles. It's very likely that, like every single peace treaty before it, it would have easily passed the Senate. However, because he went so single-handedly, the executive tried to reach beyond what it could actually do. It led to trouble when he came back to the United States and asked the Senate, which the Senate must do, to pass by 2/3 his Treaty of Versailles. Congressional leaders, Woodrow Wilson being a Democrat, and the congressional leader in the Senate, Henry Cabot Lodge, being a Republican, did not agree on philosophical terms, but it went deeper. They thought he was going too far. He had signed up the United States, but could not ratify the United States into a peace treaty that included elements that they thought were going to hurt the U.S.'s interests in the long term. So, in the end, after 3 separate votes, no Treaty of Versailles was ever ratified. Not with conditions, not at all. Eventually, through another legislative maneuver with the separate countries, they did end the war officially. But, going back to the previous slide, that crucial link, that bridge element that would have linked the world together and brought that peace that Woodrow Wilson felt would happen, never occurred. And some now say that that was in part a reason that we were led down the road within the next 2 decades to World War II, an even more dangerous and disastrous war. Let's move it up a bit. Not only does the executive start important American foreign policy movements and decision making. Here we have Tom Hanks. He is playing in a film just a couple years back, Charlie Wilson, a congressman in an important appropriations committee back in the 1980s. As Professor Summers clearly pointed out, Congress has the purse strings. They decide where money is allocated. And Charlie Wilson, as a senior member of an appropriations subcommittee, was able to secure funding to help rebels called the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union, what is now Russia. The Soviet Union, in the very late 70s, 79, had invaded Afghanistan, and Charlie Wilson had seen the refugee nightmare that occurred afterwards. So he started increasing funding with the help of some other congressmen. The movie makes it sound like it was him alone, but some other congressmen also helped out. And so the legislative really pioneered this effort to help these rebels kick out the USSR, or Soviet Union, from Afghanistan. In fact, at one point, and we talked a little bit about budgeting, the DoD, the Department of Defense, in fact did not spend all the money they had wanted to use in 1986. So he found that the DoD had $300 million unallocated at the end of their budget. What did he do? He took that money, and because he was a congressman and could appropriate, and he appropriated it all towards the Mujahideen, giving them weapons that could bring down aircrafts and destroy Russian tanks. In the end, this effort was successful, And we see an example here of where the legislative branch actually had a lot of power. I should point out that they did not have too much power. The Reagan administration was not opposed to these efforts, and they did act as a counterbalance under the separation of powers. They just happened to also agree. So, of course, they were encouraging Representative Wilson's efforts. Finally, this is from a congressional hearing by Congressman Henry Hyde in the House International Relations Committee. Henry Hyde actually formerly passed away a couple years back, but he used to be a very powerful congressman from right here in Illinois. And he is here discussing a potential U.S.-India nuclear deal. Long story short, the U.S. and India, they've had a troubled relationship when it came to nuclear technology. In the 1970s, against the wishes of both the Soviet Union and the United States, India tested a nuclear weapon. It was considered a very scary thought for those powers in charge back then, because if India could do it, they felt everyone else could. That fear still seems to play into people's minds when you hear about a country like Iran and the possibility they might be acquiring nuclear weapons. As it turns out, India was then isolated from the rest of the world, and for the next 30 years continued to have nuclear technology, mostly for peaceful purposes like nuclear energy. And no proliferation occurred. They kept good control over the technology, something that cannot be said for other countries that gained the technology, like Pakistan. So, in 2005, the Bush administration consulted with Prime Minister Singh of India about the starting of bilateral nuclear trade of technology again. There were several good points. One, it was strategic. The Bush administration thought that India might be a counterbalance for that of China in the world political scene. There was also, of course, a jobs argument that it might help American nuclear manufacturers. And finally, yes, an environmental argument, that without nuclear technology, the ability to create nuclear energy that is carbon neutral, India would have to rely on yet more coal-powered power plants. However, much as Wilson 70 years before did, the Bush administration almost entirely ignored Congress. Most congressmen, and this is from congressional aides who spoke to me on the condition of anonymity, mentioned that the first time they even heard about this supposed deal, this U.S.-India nuclear deal, was on C-SPAN as President Bush and the Prime Minister were talking about it. As you can imagine, while we may think of Congress as just this global entity, these are individuals that have to have a stake in the process. And if they don't feel they're stakeholders, they're going to be very hesitant about ever agreeing to an executive initiative. This alone showing how separation of powers can put a hold on how far that executive can reach. So here's Henry Hyde in one of 5 committee hearings on the U.S.-India nuclear deal and U.S.-India relations in general. Out of all the countries in the world that year, only China had any more committee hearings. Why? Because Congress wanted to make sure that India wasn't going to proliferate, that this was in the best interest of the United States. Even now, and during the first part, it was a Republican administration, a Republican Congress, but during the second part, it was Republican leadership in the executive and Democratic leadership in the legislative. So even when those powers were separated, because they saw it was in America's interest, because it was explained, albeit over 3 years, so not the most timely, they did in the end actually go about and pass the U.S.-India nuclear deal. Finally, we can't forget that third branch, judicial. So presidents have gotten a little bit wise to the challenges faced when they actually have to go to Congress to get something done. So increasingly, they've been using something called an executive order. They've also been using something called a memorandum of understanding. Both have been executive tools in theory, to just talk to their bureaucrats, to talk to the executive government officials, and just say, oh, by the way, we're going to do this. In theory, they see it as a way of trying to build that executive power. Okay, here's the risk of tyranny again, but the judiciary has done a great job at times cutting down this potential dictatorial effort by these different presidential administrations of both parties. Below we have a note. This note is a memoranda arguing that the United States should follow an International Court of Justice decision. The International Court of Justice decision was between the U.S. and Mexico, and it ruled that a number of Mexican nationals who are on death row in the United States should be given judicial review by the federal government. Why? Because the U.S. had signed on to the Vienna Convention of 1963, in which they promised to inform anyone who is arrested in the United States of their consular rights. So these Mexican nationals, not U.S. citizens, should have been given the right to speak with their consul. That is, a diplomat from their embassy or local consulate. As they're never given this right and sentenced to death, something that the Mexican government does not agree with. They do not agree with the death penalty. They went to court to try to get them a review of their sentence as well as their conviction in general. And the Bush administration, to their credit, did just that. Except, was it really within their powers to have judicial review? The Supreme Court reviewed this case and determined that in fact it was not. Congress would have to legislate. As in the enumerated powers, that is Congress's job. And so, despite this memorandum, it was overturned by the Supreme Court, and the associated Mexican nationals were not given judicial review in federal courts. We've talked about the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. And we've seen how separation of powers can be so crucial to keeping away any one branch from moving too far, from being too separate. And so we can reach a couple key conclusions. First off, as these examples have noted, separation of powers does prevent tyranny. We don't have an autocratic dictator here. And it's doubtful we will. Though, as Professor Summers noted, that may actually slow down the process, that is, reduces timeliness of American foreign policy. It also makes sure that what comes out of there is that of the interests of the United States. The other major point here is that consistency can sometimes be a major issue. President Wilson is over there in Paris negotiating a treaty for the whole world. He's a leader in the world scene. He comes up with most of that treaty. Can you assume then that it's the U.S.'s ideas on the table there? Well, unfortunately not. With the separation of powers, he cannot overstep his bounds. He had to bring that back to the U.S. And partially, again, because he didn't involve the legislative branch, but also in part because it didn't seem to line up with the views of many senators or many in the American public, he did not get what he wanted. Suddenly, America was a flip-flopper, okay, to use a more modern term. And that, in and of itself, can be challenging. Finally, as I said at the beginning, I hope if nothing else, you got out of this discussion an important point about the limits of how we can think about American foreign policy. Next time you see a news article, think below President Obama visiting this country and think about what's underlying it. Who's funding this? Congress is. Who's deciding the decisions related to controversial policies? The judiciary. If we think about all branches, when we go through American foreign policy, we get a much better picture and understanding of how America is interacting with the rest of the world. Thank you very much.